If you walked into that courthouse expecting to watch a marriage die, you're about to watch something far more dangerous instead. Damian Moretti had already signed the papers. 12 years of marriage reduced to ink on a page. But 30 seconds in a hospital hallway were about to unravel everything he thought he knew and drag him into the most lethal battle of his life. Not against rival families, not against federal investigators, against the man standing closest to his throne. Stay with this story until the end. If it hits you somewhere real, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The divorce papers were folded in thirds inside Damian Moretti's interior jacket pocket, pressing against his chest like a second heartbeat, except colder, and wrong in a way he couldn't name but had stopped trying to. He'd signed them 4 days ago. Sat at his desk at 2 a.m. with a glass of scotch he didn't drink and a pen he held for 11 minutes before finally moving it across the line. No ceremony to the moment, no wait he'd been expecting, just ink, and then the sound of the pen setting back down against the desk, and then silence so complete he could hear the ventilation system breathing through the walls of his study. 12 years. He didn't say it out loud. Damian Moretti didn't say things like that out loud. He folded the papers, put them in an envelope, set the envelope on the corner of his desk, and went to bed. He lay there until 4:15 without sleeping. Then he got up, showered, and started another day of running an empire that had cost him everything that ever actually mattered. His driver, Marco, picked him up at 7. They didn't speak. Marco had worked for him for 9 years and understood the particular quality of silence that meant do not attempt conversation. He navigated through the wet gray streets of the city, wipers beating a slow rhythm against January rain, while Damian sat in the back with his hands resting on his knees and his eyes fixed on nothing through the window. He was supposed to drop the papers with his attorney first, Gerald Fenn, 40 years practicing family law, who had handled the prenuptial agreement for the Moretti marriage and had the particular talent of never looking Damian directly in the eye. Fenn's office was on the 32nd floor of a building downtown, all glass and neutral carpeting and framed credentials that meant nothing to the kinds of clients he actually served. But the morning had complications. It always did. His phone rang before they'd made it 6 blocks. Not the personal phone, the other one. Damian looked at the screen. Victor Salazar. He let it ring 3 times before answering. "Tell me something useful," Damian said. "Change of schedule." Victor's voice was smooth. It had always been smooth. That was one of the things that had made him effective, and it was also, Damian had begun to understand only recently, one of the things that should have made him suspicious years ago. Fenn's assistant called. "He's been pushed to noon. Some conflict with a deposition." "Then I'll be there at noon." "Alternatively," Victor said, "I can courier the documents over, save you the trip." Damian looked at the rain on the window. "I'll handle it myself." A pause. Brief. The kind of pause that a less careful man wouldn't have noticed. "Of course. I'll let him know." The call ended. Damian set the phone face down on the seat beside him and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Marco, take me to St. Aurelius." Marco adjusted without comment. The hospital visit wasn't on his schedule. It was the kind of thing Damian did sometimes. Small deviations, unannounced, that kept his movements from becoming entirely predictable. Old habit. Born in the years when predictability got men killed. He had a standing arrangement with the hospital's oncology wing, a significant annual endowment, no publicity attached. He checked in periodically. It was one of the few things he did that had no tactical purpose and that he never discussed with anyone. That, at least, was what he told himself. What he didn't tell himself, what he refused to examine too directly, was that Elena had spent 2 months volunteering in that same wing 3 years ago, before everything started falling apart between them. That the hallways smelled like the particular antiseptic she used to come home carrying on her clothes. That standing in them made him feel something adjacent to grief that he couldn't categorize and therefore ignored. He was good at ignoring things that didn't have a category. The hospital was 30 minutes out. He sat with the divorce papers pressing against his ribs and watched the city move past the rain-blurred glass and let himself think, briefly and against his better judgment, about the first time he'd ever seen Elena Vasquez. Not at the introduction arranged by her uncle, a man who ran legitimate shipping concerns and highly illegitimate cargo arrangements along the eastern seaboard. That meeting had been formal, tactical, an alliance in the language of handshakes and careful conversation over dinner in a private room. Elena had been composed that night, polished. She'd looked at him with dark eyes that gave absolutely nothing away, and he had respected her for it even as he filed her away as a complication to be managed. No. The first time he'd actually seen her was 2 weeks later, at a charity event neither of them had wanted to attend. He'd found her on the terrace, alone, heels in her hand, eating a bread roll she'd apparently pocketed from the dinner service, looking out at the harbor with the specific expression of a person who had temporarily stopped performing for other people. She hadn't heard him come out, and for 30 seconds, long enough to feel like a decision, he'd stood there and watched her be real before she heard his footstep and the mask came back up. He'd married her 10 months later. He stopped thinking about it. The hospital's east entrance was quieter than the main lobby. A security team member held the door. Damian moved through the familiar corridors, exchanged brief words with the wing administrator, a small woman named Dr. Hargrove, who had learned to give him her updates in under 4 minutes. She did so now. He listened, asked 2 questions, approved a funding reallocation she'd been tentatively requesting for 6 weeks, and moved on. He was heading back toward the elevator when he heard Elena's voice. It stopped him the way very few things in the world could stop Damian Moretti. Not loudly, not with any force, just the particular sound of it, low, careful, slightly thickened in a way that told him immediately that she'd been crying, drifting through a door that stood open perhaps 4 inches. He didn't move. He should have kept walking. Should have let it be the clean ending it was supposed to be. Papers delivered, attorney notified, 12 years dissolved in legal language and filed in triplicate. He was good at clean endings. He'd built his entire professional existence on the ability to close things decisively and not look back. Instead, he stood 6 feet from a half-open hospital room door and listened to his wife fall apart. Doesn't know. He can't know, Mama. That's the whole point. Her voice caught, recovered, caught again. If he investigates, if he starts looking, they'll do it. They said they would. They've proven they can get to people he trusts. I watched it happen. I watched it, and I couldn't say anything. A pause. Her mother's voice, lower, harder to make out. A question. No, Elena said, firm. Even through the tears, firm in a way that was so specifically her that Damian felt something move in his chest that he didn't have language for. No, I'm not going to tell him. I'm not going to change the plan. He signs the papers, I leave, and they have no more reason to follow through. That was the agreement. They want me out of his life. If I go, he's safe. Another low exchange. Her mother again, the words indistinct, the tone unmistakable, the tight, frightened voice of a woman arguing against something she can see is already decided. You don't understand what he is to me. Elena's voice dropped even further. Damian had to stay very, very still to hear it. I know what people say about him. I know what he is. I know every dark thing he's ever done, and I have never, not once, I have never stopped. She broke. Just for a moment. The sound of it went into Damian like a blade between the ribs. I love him more than I know how to explain to you. More than I love being safe. More than I love being happy. But loving someone doesn't mean getting them killed. So I'm going to walk away, and he's going to think I didn't care, and that is the price I am willing to pay. Do you understand? I am choosing this. Silence. Then very quietly her mother said something. 2 words, maybe 3, and Elena made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob and was somehow more devastating than either. I know, Mama, she said. I know. Damian walked away. He made it to the elevator, pressed the button, stood inside the mirrored box while the floors descended, and looked at the man in the reflection in front of him. He looked exactly the same as he had this morning. That struck him as wrong. Something this large should show. He walked back through the east entrance. Marco was at the curb. Damian got in, sat down, and stared at the envelope in his jacket pocket without touching it. Mr. Moretti? Marco said without turning around. The attorney's office? No, Damian said. Drive. Anywhere specific? No. Marco drove. Damian sat with 12 years of marriage in his chest pocket and everything he thought he'd understood dissolving around him like the rain dissolving against the glass. And he started thinking, really thinking, with the cold, systematic part of his brain that had kept him alive through things that should have killed him, about everything that had happened over the last 8 months. The fight that hadn't quite made sense. The missed call he'd never fully explained to himself. The coldness between them that he had attributed to exhaustion, to the weight of what he was and what she lived with, to the slow erosion of a marriage under too much pressure. He'd watched it happen and told himself it was inevitable. That men like him didn't get to keep things like her. That the distance was real because everything good eventually became distant. He had built an entire architecture of resignation around what he was now understanding had been something else entirely. Someone had done this. The thought arrived with a precision that cut through everything else. Not a slow erosion, not the natural death of something that couldn't survive his world. Someone had looked at his marriage, identified it as a vulnerability, and deliberately destroyed it from the inside. Manufactured the distance, engineered the silence, convinced Elena that leaving was the only way to keep him breathing, and made him watch it happen and call it something he deserved. He felt something in his jaw tighten. He breathed through it. He needed to be very careful now, more careful than he had ever been in his life. Because if this was what he thought it was, if someone inside his organization had done this, then that person had been watching him, studying him, understanding exactly how his mind worked and exactly which levers to pull, which meant they would be watching now, would be watching for any deviation from the script, any sign that Damian Moretti had stopped performing the role of a man who had given up. He had to keep performing it. He pulled out his phone, not the other one, the personal line, and sent Elena a single text message. 3 words. The kind of thing a man says when he's still in the process of dismantling something. I'll be in touch. Cold, appropriate. Exactly what the man he'd been pretending to be for the last 8 months would send. Her reply came 4 minutes later. Okay. 1 word. He read it 3 times. The envelope stayed in his pocket. He would deliver it to Fen at noon. He would follow every step of the script as written, because the person who had written it needed to believe it was still being followed. And while they were watching Damian Moretti dismantle his marriage according to their plan, Damian Moretti was going to find out exactly who they were. There was a man named Caruso, Ray Caruso, who had retired from Damian's organization 6 years ago and now ran a bait shop on the coast that didn't make nearly enough money to explain his lifestyle. Caruso had been the best intelligence operative Damian had ever employed. The best because he thought diagonally, because he was deeply suspicious of the obvious answer, and because he had a gift for identifying the one person in the room who was directing everyone else's attention somewhere else. Caruso was the only person Damian was going to trust with this. Not because he trusted him completely. He didn't trust anyone completely, hadn't since he was 19 years old and learned what that kind of faith cost. But because Caruso was outside the organization, whatever rot existed inside it couldn't have reached him. There was also a man named Briggs, Dennis Briggs, FBI, Counterintelligence Division, who had been feeding Damian information on rival operations for 3 years in exchange for Damian burying evidence of a financial arrangement that would have ended Briggs' career and marriage simultaneously. The arrangement was distasteful in the way most necessary arrangements were. Briggs was compromised, venal, and scared of being caught, which made him useful. A scared man with something to lose would dig up anything you asked him to if the alternative was exposure. He would reach out to Briggs carefully, through a channel that had never been connected to anything that could be traced back to the current situation. The car moved through the city, rain, gray, January holding the streets in its fist. Damian thought about Victor Salazar. Not accusingly, not yet. That was the kind of thinking that got people killed, reaching for the conclusion before the evidence took you there. But Victor Salazar was his underboss, had been for 4 years, had worked his way into that position with a combination of competence, loyalty, and the specific talent of making himself indispensable at exactly the moments when Damian most needed someone he could rely on. That talent now presented itself in a different light, indispensable, everywhere, in every room, Every decision, every piece of intelligence that came in and went out. A man who had positioned himself so thoroughly inside the organization that Damian had stopped noticing him the way you stop noticing your own heartbeat. What better position from which to run a shadow operation? Damian looked at the rain on the glass. He thought about the conversation he'd had with Victor 2 months ago, when the situation with Elena had already been deteriorating for some time. Victor had sat across from him with that smooth, careful face and said something that had struck Damian in the moment as surprisingly perceptive. Some marriages can't survive what we do. It's not a failure of the people. It's just the cost of the work. Damian had taken it as condolence. He was beginning to understand it might have been something else. He had the attorney meeting at noon. He would deliver the papers. He would be seen doing it, and whoever was watching would tick that box and consider it done. He would return home, eat dinner, go through the ordinary mechanics of an evening, and make no unusual calls from any traceable line. Tonight, very late, he would drive himself, not Marco, not any of his usual drivers, to a storage unit on the east side of the city, where he kept a second phone in a lockbox. He would use that phone to reach Caruso. He would begin. The car pulled up outside Gerald Fenn's building at 11:58. Damian straightened his jacket, put his hand against the outside of his pocket for just a moment, feeling the folded edge of the envelope through the fabric. Then he got out of the car and walked through the glass doors of the building and rode the elevator to the 32nd floor, carrying his marriage in his pocket and a cold, surgical fury in his chest that he had no intention of showing to anyone. Fenn's waiting room was beige and climate-controlled. A receptionist with a practiced neutral expression offered coffee he didn't take. He sat in a chair that cost more than most people's monthly rent and looked at a landscape painting on the wall, something vague and blue, and thought about Elena's voice through a 4-inch gap in a hospital door. More than I love being safe. More than I love being happy. He thought about the 8 months of silence between them, the way she'd retreated, the way he'd watched her retreat and told himself it was the inevitable conclusion of a marriage that had always been structurally unsound. He'd been so sure of himself, so certain he understood what was happening. They had used his certainty against him, whoever they were. They had taken the most self-contained part of Damian Moretti's personality, that unshakable confidence in his own read of a situation, and weaponized it. Made him so certain he was losing her that he'd never considered he might be being made to lose her. He wanted to put his fist through the beige wall. He sat very still and looked at the blue landscape and breathed. Fenn appeared at the inner door. Damian. The eyes, as always, aimed slightly to the left of his face. 11 years of working together, and the man still couldn't make direct eye contact. Come in. The office was large, south-facing, the January rain doing its work on the floor-to-ceiling windows. Ben settled behind his desk with the paperwork arranged in front of him. He had the particular demeanor of a man who has delivered bad news so many times that it no longer registers as bad, only as procedural. Everything appears to be in order, Fenn said, scanning the documents. Elena's attorney has reviewed. No contests. It's really just a matter of filing. Then file it, Damian said. Fenn looked up at him, briefly, then back to the documents. There's one more signature required, a formality, just confirming the date of, tell me where to sign. Fenn turned a page, indicated a line. Damian took the pen, pressed it to the paper, and then held it there for the length of a breath. He signed. He signed because he had to, because the man who had orchestrated this needed to see it happen, because pulling out now, before he knew exactly who he was dealing with and exactly how far the infection had spread, would be the most dangerous thing he could do. He was playing a role, and the role required him to keep performing, no matter what it cost him. He set the pen down. Timeline, he said. 60 days once it's filed. Standard processing, barring any... Fine. He stood. I'll see myself out. Back in the elevator. Back in the lobby. Back through the glass doors into the cold, wet air of January, where Marco waited at the curb with the engine running. Damian got in, sat down, let the door close. He looked at his hands. They were completely steady. They had been steady through all of it. The signing, the walk through the hallway, the elevator descent. He had excellent control of his exterior. Had cultivated it since he was a young man watching his father, who had not had excellent control of his exterior and had paid for it in the particular way men in their world paid for emotional legibility. Inside, he was something else. Inside, he was calculating. Every conversation over the past 8 months was being run through a new filter. Every piece of information that had come to him about Elena, about her behavior, her supposed distance, the rumor that had reached him 3 months ago, delivered by a man whose name he would look at very carefully in the next few days, suggesting that Elena had been in contact with people she shouldn't have been, was being reassessed. Not emotionally, tactically. She'd been protecting him, alone, for months. Sitting in the cold silence with a death threat hanging over his head, delivered to her, held by her, carried by her, while he mistook her silence for indifference and signed papers to end their marriage. The person who had engineered this was very good. Damian could acknowledge that without enjoying it. It took real skill to turn a man's strengths into the mechanism of his own betrayal, to understand him well enough to make him destroy something precious with his own hands, convinced the whole time that the destruction was his own sovereign choice. That person was still inside his organization, walking around, attending meetings, looking him in the eye, perhaps even managing to perform concern about the divorce, some well-calibrated expression of sympathy, of collegial regret, designed to reinforce the performance that everything was proceeding as expected. He was going to find them. He was going to do it slowly, carefully, and completely. He was going to dismantle every layer of what they'd built until he had a name and a face and a clear, unambiguous chain of evidence that couldn't be explained away. And then he was going to deal with it in the way that his world dealt with things that couldn't be fixed any other way. He pulled out his personal phone and looked at Elena's last text again. Okay. 1 word. He thought about everything contained in that word, the weight she'd been carrying, the specific texture of choosing to let him go because letting him go was the only thing she could think of that might keep him alive. He put the phone away. Home, he told Marco. The car moved. Rain, gray, the city going about its business around a man who was going about his in the quiet and systematic and very deliberate way that had made him what he was. He had one advantage that his enemy didn't know about yet. The enemy believed Damian was broken, believed the marriage was the vulnerability that had been successfully exploited, the wound that would keep him distracted and diminished for months while the real moves were being made. They didn't know what he'd heard through a hospital door. They didn't know that Elena had not, in fact, stopped loving him. That she had been carrying a loaded gun of information with the safety on for 8 months, choosing his life over her marriage, and that the man they believed was collapsing under the weight of a failed relationship was instead the most dangerous version of Damian Moretti that had ever existed. A man with something to fight for, a man who knew his enemy had been clever enough to almost work, almost. He was almost home when his phone buzzed again. The personal line, an unknown number, not a contact, not a saved name, and when he answered it with silence, waiting, the voice on the other end said 3 words in a flat, neutral tone before the line went dead. 3 words that told him the investigation was already more urgent than he'd thought, that waiting even another 48 hours might cost him everything he'd just decided to protect. He sat very still in the back of the car and understood that the clock had just started without him. The 3 words were, "She's been moved." Damian didn't know the voice. Male, mid-range, no accent he could place, the specific vocal quality of someone who had trained themselves to sound like nobody. The call lasted 4 seconds and left behind a silence that pressed against the interior of the car like something physical. He didn't react, didn't move, kept his hands on his knees and his eyes on the rain-blurred street and ran the words through every possible interpretation until one of them stuck. She's been moved. Elena. Someone was having Elena watched, and that someone had just told him about it, which meant there was a third party in play he hadn't accounted for. Someone who knew enough to have eyes on his wife and had chosen this specific moment, hours after the divorce papers hit Fenn's desk, to make contact. That was either a gift or a trap, and the first rule of surviving long enough to tell the difference was to treat every gift like a trap until proven otherwise. He made himself wait until he was inside the house before he did anything. The house was large and mostly quiet, in the way that houses get quiet when the person who filled them with a specific kind of presence has been absent long enough that the rooms stop expecting her. Elena had been gone for 6 weeks. She was staying at a serviced apartment 40 minutes across the city, an arrangement handled through her attorney, civil and undramatic, and completely consistent with the story everyone was supposed to believe. Damian walked through the front hall, shrugged off his jacket, hung it over the back of a chair in his study rather than the hook beside the door, the way he usually did. A small thing, but Elena had been the one who always straightened it from the chair back to the hook, and he had not been able to make himself hang it correctly since she left. He wasn't going to examine that. He was going to leave it on the chair and get to work. He sat at his desk, opened his laptop, did 20 minutes of entirely routine correspondence, nothing that would look unusual to anyone monitoring his activity, and then told the house system he was going to sleep early, killed the study lights, and sat in the dark for 6 minutes. Then he went down to the basement. The storage room at the back of the basement had a false rear wall. Behind it was a space roughly the size of a large closet, dry and climate-controlled, with a small desk, a shielded phone line, and a lockbox. He'd built it 11 years ago, when he'd first understood that having a place no one else knew about wasn't paranoia, but arithmetic. He opened the lockbox. The second phone was exactly where he'd left it, fully charged. He turned it on, waited for it to cycle up, and dialed Caruso. It rang 9 times. He was about to end the call when the line connected, and Ray Caruso said, with the tone of a man who has been expecting bad news his whole life and is simply waiting to find out what shape it's taken this time. "I figured you'd call eventually." "You've been tracking something," Damian said. Not a question. A pause. The sound of something being set down. A glass, maybe. 6 weeks ago, someone reached out to a contact of mine. Phishing. Wanted to know if I had any residual access to your internal communications. What did you tell them? That I'd been out 6 years and was selling nightcrawlers for a living, which is true. What they were trying to find out is whether I had any residual loyalty to you, which I didn't answer because the answer to that question is complicated and none of their business. Who reached out? I don't have a name. I have a method. The approach was clean, layered, used 2 cutouts. But the style of it, the way the questions were sequenced, I've seen that before. Inside your organization, years ago when I was still active. Another pause. Someone who learned fieldcraft from the same place I learned it, which narrows it down. How far does it narrow it? To people who've been with you long enough to have been trained by the people who trained me, which is a short list, Damian. He knew the list. He didn't say the name at the top of it yet because saying it out loud before he had more would be the kind of thing that got men killed. Not by the enemy, but by their own premature certainty. "I need eyes on my wife," he said. Discreet. Nothing she'd notice. "I need to know who else is watching her and from where." "Already complicated," Caruso said. "If someone moved her recently, they may have picked up counter-surveillance. Putting new eyes on her without being spotted by the people already watching. Can you do it or not?" A breath. "I can put someone on it. Give me 36 hours. "You have 24. He ended the call. He sat in the small dark room for a moment, then dialed Briggs. Briggs picked up on the second ring, which meant he was awake and anxious, which he almost always was these days. The man had the particular nervous energy of someone sitting on a secret that kept getting heavier. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you," Briggs said. "I need a financial trace. Internal. My own organization. I'm looking for irregular cash movement over the last 10 to 14 months. Specifically, anything that routes through a third party and comes back clean." Silence. Briggs processing the ask, calculating his exposure. "That's different from what we usually—" "Dennis?" Damian kept his voice flat. "I'm not asking you to file a report. I'm asking you to look at numbers. You're good at numbers." Another silence. Longer. Then, "What am I looking for specifically?" "Someone who's been funding a private operation. Not through legitimate channels. They'd be too smart for that. Through favors, through debt forgiveness, through the kind of thing that doesn't show up unless you're looking sideways at it. Payments that look like they go one place and arrive somewhere else. Timeline? 10 months back. Maybe more. Start with the month where the pattern changes and work backward. And if I find something, you call this number. Only this number. And then you forget you found it. He ended the call and sat with the dark and the hum of the climate control and thought about 10 months ago. What had been different then? What had shifted? 10 months ago, Elena had started pulling back. He'd noticed it as a coolness, an increased distance at dinner, a tendency to find reasons to be elsewhere when he was home. He had attributed it to accumulated stress. His world was not easy to live adjacent to, and they had been having the same fundamental argument in different forms for the better part of 2 years. He told himself it was a marriage doing what marriages did when the foundation had too many cracks. 10 months ago, Victor Salazar had proposed a significant restructuring of the organization's eastern operations. Damian had approved it after 3 weeks of review. The restructuring had gone smoothly. Too smoothly, maybe, in retrospect. A reorganization of that scope usually generated friction, personnel disputes, the kind of territorial conflict that was ugly and necessary. This one had produced almost none, because Victor had been managing it, carefully. Moving the right people into the right positions, not to optimize operations, but to optimize his own information control. And Damian had watched it happen and called it competence. He went back upstairs and did not sleep. He was at his desk at 6 the next morning when Marco arrived. He spent the morning doing what he was supposed to do. Meetings, calls, 2 hours reviewing a contract dispute with a legitimate construction company he used for money management purposes. He sat across from Victor Salazar at 11 for their weekly operations review and looked at the man's smooth, attentive face and said nothing that was not completely consistent with the story Victor was watching. Victor was 41, compact, well-dressed, with the careful stillness of a man who had learned very early that visible emotion was a liability. He had dark eyes that processed everything and gave back only what he decided to give back. He'd come up through the organization the right way, slowly, demonstrably, earning each step. That was the thing about him that had made Damian trust him. He had never seemed in a hurry. Now Damian understood the patience differently. The Fen meeting went smoothly? Victor asked, near the end of the review. Routine, Damian said. Victor nodded, a small, appropriate nod, sympathetic without being intrusive. You holding up all right? Not a question, the kind of statement that performs concern while actually confirming a data point. I'm fine, Damian said. Victor looked at him for just a moment, a look that Damian now read as an assessment, checking whether the subject was continuing to deteriorate as expected. Good, that's good. He turned back to the folder in front of him. The Portsmouth situation still needs a decision on the 3rd. Push it a week. The delay might, push it a week, Victor. A pause. Brief. Of course. They finished the review. Victor gathered his materials with the precise, unhurried movements of a man completely comfortable in the room he was in. At the door he paused, and the pause was slightly too long, the kind of beat that a man inserts when he has something to add and is deciding whether to add it. There's one more thing, Victor said. A small thing. Word reached me that Elena was seen leaving her apartment building yesterday evening with luggage. I don't know if that's relevant to anything. I just thought you'd want to know. Damian looked at him. Victor held the look with appropriate measured steadiness. Thank you, Damian said. After Victor left, Damian sat for a long time without moving. The information about Elena's movement, delivered as an afterthought, as a small thing, as something Victor was only mentioning because he thought Damian might want to know, was not a small thing. It was confirmation, delivered in the language of concern, that Victor had eyes on Elena. Had always had eyes on Elena. Had been monitoring her movements for months, making sure she was continuing to comply with whatever threat he'd used to put her in motion. He pulled out the personal phone and sent Elena a text from the account they'd been communicating on since the separation. Bland, procedural. Any update on the timeline for collecting the rest of your things from the house? Something a man sends when he's in the mechanical stages of disentanglement and trying to keep things organized. She replied in 20 minutes. I'll arrange it through the attorneys. No need for you to be there. Clean, cold. Exactly what she would say if she was still playing her role. keeping him at safe distance, protecting him in the only way she knew how to from where she was standing. He put the phone down and pressed his hand flat against the surface of his desk and breathed until the thing in his chest settled back into something he could manage. Caruso called back in 19 hours, not 24. 3 teams, Caruso said. His voice had a new quality, tighter, more careful. She's got 3 separate surveillance teams on her, different vehicles, rotating positions, good spacing, professional work, not showy. This isn't intimidation surveillance. This is compliance monitoring. They're not trying to scare her. They're making sure she stays on script. Can your man stay dark? So far. But 3 teams is significant resource investment. Whoever put this together isn't running it on a personal budget. This is organizational money. Where did they move her to? The Alderton. It's a residential hotel on the west side. Decent security. Public, enough that she's visible, isolated enough that anyone who tries to contact her would be seen doing it. A pause. There's something else. One of the surveillance team members, my guy ran a partial plate, cross-referenced a vehicle registration, comes back to a shell company. The shell company has a parent entity. The parent entity has a silent investor whose name I can't get to directly, but the structure of it, the way it's layered, is consistent with a pattern I've seen before in the eastern operations of your family. Damian said nothing for a moment. How consistent? Consistent enough that I'd bet the bait shop on it. Someone is running this parallel structure directly inside your own money, not beside it, inside it. Which means they have access to financial controls you didn't know they had, or that you gave them at some point without fully understanding what you were authorizing. The restructuring, 10 months ago. The Eastern Operations reorganization that had gone too smoothly because Victor had been managing not just the logistics but the access controls. Rewriting financial authorities in ways that looked like operational efficiency and were, in fact, the installation of a private mechanism. Caruso, Damian said. I need a name, not a guess. A provable connection. I know what you need. Give me the access and I can get it. What access? The internal audit records from the restructuring, whoever signed off on the sub-account authorizations, whoever their signatures point back to, that's your provable connection. Those records are internal. Yes, Caruso said. So someone inside needs to pull them without being seen doing it. Someone who has access and a reason to be looking at old restructuring documentation that wouldn't raise a flag. Damian thought. There was a woman in his accounting division, Petra Vasek, 47, had been with the organization 15 years, was scrupulously non-political, and known for exactly the kind of institutional memory that made her useful for exactly this kind of retrieval. She was not in Victor's inner circle. She was not in anyone's inner circle. She was the kind of person who survived inside an organization by being professionally invisible. The risk was in asking her. Any approach to any internal employee was a potential leak if that employee had been turned or compromised. But he needed those records, and he couldn't pull them himself without signaling. He ended the call with Caruso and spent 4 hours thinking about Petra Vasek, about her 15 years of documented decisions, every interaction he'd ever had with her, the specific texture of her professional demeanor. He thought about the one time, 7 years ago, that she'd come to him directly, bypassing Victor, who had not yet been underboss but had already been building toward it, to flag an accounting irregularity that turned out to be minor but that she'd felt strongly enough about to escalate. She'd been scared to bring it to him. He remembered that clearly. Scared but doing it anyway because she thought it was right. He called her from the second phone. She answered with the neutral tone of someone receiving an unrecognized number. It's Damian, he said. Don't say my name, don't react. A beat. Controlled. She was good. All right. I need you to pull the sub-account authorization records from the Eastern Operations restructuring. The complete file, not the summary. I need it by tomorrow morning, and I need it delivered to a location I'll send you in a separate message. Tell no one. Do not access it from your usual workstation. Go to a public terminal or use a personal device. Silence. Ms. Vasek, he said. I understand, she said. Careful. Low. And I want you to know, there's been something I've been wanting to bring to you for a while. I wasn't sure how. I wasn't sure if it was safe to. His hand tightened on the phone. What kind of something? The kind that involves signatures that don't match and account movements that only make sense if someone had a set of access codes they shouldn't have had. She paused. I've been sitting on it for 3 months because I didn't know who I could tell without... She stopped. Without it getting back to the wrong person, Damian said. Yes. Bring everything, the sub-accounts and whatever you've been sitting on. He ended the call. Briggs came back the same afternoon in the manner they'd agreed. A message routed through a service that looked like spam and was not, with 4 attached files that represented approximately 200 pages of financial cross-referencing. Damian opened them on a device that had never been connected to any of his organizational networks and spent 3 hours going through them. What he found was meticulous. That was the word that kept presenting itself as he worked through the layers. Meticulous. Patient. The cash movements were small individually, distributed across enough accounts and time periods that a routine audit would never catch the pattern. But assembled, mapped against the timeline of the Eastern restructuring and the subsequent 12 months, they described something clear. A private operational fund built inside his own organization, drawing from resources that Victor Salazar's new access codes had made available. The fund had been used for several things. Payments to individuals Damian recognized as low-level information brokers, people who sold intelligence about the internal dynamics of organizations like his. Payments to a private security firm whose name he didn't recognize but which, cross-referenced against Caruso's surveillance team data, corresponded almost exactly to the company structure Caruso had identified. And one additional set of payments that he stared at for a long time. A series of transfers, 9 months ago, to an account belonging to a man named Soto, Miguel Soto, who had been a mid-level lieutenant in Damian's organization and who had left, abruptly, cleanly, with a settlement and a non-disclosure 8.5 months ago after delivering to Damian, through channels that had seemed reliable at the time, information suggesting that Elena had been in contact with a competing family. He sat with that for a moment. Soto. The information about Elena had come from Soto, who had been paid, well before that information was delivered, from a fund controlled by Victor Salazar. The timeline was unambiguous. The payment had preceded the information by 6 weeks. Victor had bought the lie, handed it to his delivery mechanism, and Damian had received it, and because it had arrived through a channel he trusted, had believed it, had let it settle into the already deteriorating landscape of his marriage as confirmation of something he was already afraid might be true. He thought about what Elena must have felt when the coldness in him changed after that. When she realized he'd heard something about her and had chosen to believe it and said nothing, had simply drawn further back, further into the ice, giving her more silence to interpret as contempt. And she had not defended herself, had not pushed back, had not demanded to know what he'd heard or where it came from, because she was already receiving threats, already operating inside whatever arrangement Victor had imposed on her. She'd taken his silence and his growing coldness as one more thing she had to absorb without showing him why. He stood up, walked to the far wall, pressed both palms flat against the plaster and stood there for a moment, breathing. He had what he needed. Not everything. Not the final documented chain that would make the case airtight, but enough. Enough to know the shape of it. Victor had constructed a false evidence architecture around Elena, fed it to Damian through a compromised source, managed the emotional deterioration of the marriage, while simultaneously threatening Elena directly to ensure she cooperated with her own removal. The whole operation had been designed to isolate Damian, emotionally, relationally, to strip away the one person who had no political agenda and no organizational loyalty except to him personally. And it had very nearly worked. His phone buzzed. The personal line. A text from a number he didn't recognize, different from the one that had called yesterday with the 3 words. And what it contained was not a message, but an image. Elena, photographed through a long lens, standing outside the Alderton in a coat he recognized. She was looking at her phone. She looked tired in the way that people look tired when they've been tired for a very long time and have stopped being able to hide it. Below the image, a single line of text. 36 hours before we stop being patient. The countdown had just been handed to him explicitly. Whoever was running Victor's operation on the ground had decided that the divorce filing wasn't enough, that Elena's continued presence in the city, even isolated and compliant, was a loose end that needed resolving, and that 36 hours was the timeline they were offering before they resolved it in a way that would not require her cooperation. Damian looked at the photograph for 5 seconds. Then he put the phone in his jacket pocket, went upstairs, and called Victor Salazar. "I need to see you tonight," he said. "At the Whitmore, 9 o'clock. Victor said, "Of course, everything all right?" "I want to talk about the Portsmouth situation," Damian said. "I changed my mind about the delay." The Whitmore was a private dining establishment that didn't advertise and didn't need to. 3 floors, 12 tables, the kind of place where the staff had been selected as much for their discretion as their competence. Damian had used it for sensitive meetings for 11 years. Victor knew it well, had sat across from Damian at its tables dozens of times, eating good food and discussing things that required walls that didn't have ears. Tonight, Damian arrived 20 minutes early. He sat with his back to the wall, facing the door, and ordered water he didn't drink, and thought about the photograph on his phone and the 36-hour window and what he was going to do with the next 2 hours. He was not going to confront Victor directly. That was the thing he had to keep reminding himself of, because the part of him that wanted to reach across the table and take the man apart with his bare hands was loud tonight in a way it rarely was. Damian had spent his adult life developing the ability to delay that particular impulse until the correct moment. Tonight the impulse was louder than usual. He needed Victor calm and unaware for at least another 24 hours. He needed to confirm the chain of evidence through Petrovacek's files, which were supposed to be delivered by morning. He needed Caruso's team to establish the full surveillance network around Elena so that when he moved, he could move on all of it simultaneously and not leave a loose end that could get her killed in the gap. So tonight was theater. Tonight was Damian Moretti behaving like a man who had just reconsidered a business delay and wanted to talk through it. Believable, because it was consistent with how he operated. Victor would read it as exactly that. The boss, grinding forward even while his personal life disintegrated around him, because the organization didn't pause for marriages. Victor arrived at 9:02. He was wearing a dark jacket, no tie, the particular calibration of casual that men in their world used to signal they were relaxed without being careless. He sat down, declined the menu, ordered scotch, and looked at Damian with the expression Damian had spent the last 48 hours reinterpreting in real time. There it was. Under the smoothness, under the appropriate measured attention, a watchfulness that was not the watchfulness of a loyal subordinate reading his boss's state. It was the watchfulness of a man checking a trap. "Portsmouth," Damian said. They talked business for 90 minutes. Damian was precise, focused, asked the right questions, and pushed back on 2 of Victor's positions in ways that were grounded enough to be credible and not so aggressive as to signal anything other than normal operational friction. Victor answered well. He was good. He would have been genuinely valuable if he hadn't decided to also be something else. Near the end, Victor set down his glass and said, "How are you sleeping?" Damian looked at him. "Fine." "Because you look—" A slight pause, calibrated. "You look like a man carrying something heavy." "I'm always carrying something heavy," Damian said. "That's the job." Victor almost smiled. "Not quite." "Of course." He picked up the glass again. "The Elena situation, I know you said you're fine, but these things have a way of catching up. If you need to take a step back from some of the operational load in the next few weeks, I can handle the day-to-day." There it was. Offered his consideration, the hand reaching out to take more of the controls while the subject was confirmed to be destabilized. "I appreciate that," Damian said. "I'll let you know." He drove home himself, sat in the driveway for a moment before going in. The night was clear and cold, the earlier rain having moved through, and he could see stars in the gaps between the clouds. And he looked at them and felt absolutely nothing poetic about it, just the cold and the dark, and the specific quality of fury that had been building in him for 48 hours, and that he had been managing with the same clinical attention he gave to everything that needed managing. He went inside, went to the basement, sat at the small desk in the dark room, and called Caruso. "I need the full surveillance map by 6 a.m., he said. "I'll have it. And I need extraction capacity. If I have to move Elena quickly, within an hour, I need a team that can get her out of the Alderton and to a location the existing surveillance network doesn't know about. How many bodies on the extraction? Enough that it's not contestable. Damian, Caruso's voice shifted. If Victor's teams are watching her with that kind of resource, pulling her out is going to be noticed. The moment she moves, he'll know you moved her, which tells him you know. I know. So you're accelerating. The timeline accelerated without my input, 36 hours from last night. Caruso breathed. All right, I'll have extraction capacity in place by 5 a.m. But you need to understand, but once you use it, the whole thing comes open. There's no more quiet investigation. You're in a direct confrontation with a man who has spent 10 months preparing for exactly that scenario. Then I'd better be more prepared than he is, Damian said. He ended the call and sat in the quiet and reviewed for the fourth time everything he had. The financial records from Briggs, the surveillance identification from Caruso, the timeline of Soto's payments, the pattern of the Eastern restructuring. What he didn't have yet, what Petrovasek was supposed to be bringing him, was the signed authorization documents, the specific paperwork that would show Victor Salazar's signature on access codes he should never have possessed. Without that, everything else was a pattern. Compelling, damning as a pattern, but not a name on a page. Not the thing you showed to the 3 remaining senior men in the organization. Men who had known Victor for years and would not act on a pattern alone. To justify what Damian was going to have to do, he needed those documents. He set an alarm for 4:30 and went upstairs and lay down on the bed without undressing and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep. At 4:47 his phone rang. The second phone. Caruso's line. He answered immediately. Vasek didn't make the drop, Caruso said. Damian sat up. What do you mean she didn't make the drop? My contact at the location, she never showed. I've been trying to raise her for the last 40 minutes. Her personal phone is going straight to voicemail. He was on his feet. Where is she? I don't know. Last confirmed location was her apartment building, 11 p.m., entering the lobby. After that, a pause. Damian, if someone made her, if they knew she was pulling those files, he was already moving. Jacket, keys. The Alderton. What's the status on Elena? Hold on. The sound of rapid typing, of Caruso talking low and fast to someone else, then back. My man on the street says the surveillance teams are still in position. She's still inside as of... Another pause. Longer this time. Wait. What? One of the vehicles just moved. The north position. They're repositioning. All 3 teams, Caruso's voice went tight. They're converging on the building. The bottom dropped out of the floor. Get your extraction team to the Alderton now, Damian said. He was already in his car. Right now, Caruso. Don't wait for me. He drove fast. The city at 4:50 a.m. was mostly empty. The streets belonging to delivery trucks and insomniacs and men doing things that didn't get done in daylight. He took the route that bypassed the 2 traffic signals that would have slowed him and ran one light that he shouldn't have and got to the Alderton in 19 minutes. Caruso's extraction team was already there. 3 vehicles, 4 men, positioned around the building's secondary entrance. His phone showed a message from Caruso. Unit 4 confirms subject still in building. Surveillance teams stalled at perimeter. Something spooked them. He went in through the side entrance. The overnight desk clerk looked up, and Damian looked back at him, and the clerk decided to find something else to look at. The elevator was slow. He took the stairs. Room 714. He knocked twice, paused, knocked once more. The pattern he'd sent her in that procedural text 12 hours ago. The one that had looked like a message about scheduling and contained a code she would recognize because they had established codes years ago, back in the early years of the marriage, when he'd insisted she have a way to verify that anyone who came to her on his behalf was genuinely on his behalf. He'd never expected to use it like this. 30 seconds. Then the door opened. Elena stood in the doorway in a gray sweatshirt and dark pants, barefoot, her hair loose, her face carrying the specific exhaustion of someone who has not been sleeping well for a very long time. She looked at him, and something moved through her expression that she didn't have time to lock down before it was visible. Shock, relief, And underneath both of those, fear. The particular fear of someone who has been alone with a very bad secret and suddenly isn't alone anymore. Then the mask came back up. "Damian," she said. Her voice was careful, level. "What are you doing here?" "We need to move," he said. "Right now. Bring what you can carry." "I don't, Elena." He held her eyes. "I heard you at the hospital 3 days ago, through the door." The mask didn't fall. It dissolved. All at once, the careful composure she'd been maintaining simply ceased to exist, and what was under it was something he hadn't seen on her face in over a year. The unguarded version of her, raw and terrified and exhausted past the point of managing it. "How much did you hear?" she said. "Enough. All of it, I think." He kept his voice low. "We don't have time for this conversation right now. The teams outside are moving. Someone found out I was digging and they're accelerating." She moved. He'd always appreciated that about her. She didn't freeze, didn't spiral into paralysis. She went to the closet, grabbed a bag that was already partially packed. She'd been living ready to move, he realized, had been keeping herself in a state of prepared departure for weeks. And she was at the door in 90 seconds. In the stairwell, moving fast, she said, "Vasek." He looked at her sharply. "What about Vasek?" "Petra Vasek. She called me last night. She said she was bringing you something and that she was scared and that if anything happened to her, I should tell you to look at the secondary authorization files, the ones that were re-signed during the restructuring. She said the original signatures had been replaced." Elena's voice was steady, even as they moved fast down the concrete stairs. "I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know you'd already been looking." "She called you," he said. "She called me because she didn't know who else was safe. She knew about the separation, and she called me because she thought I was still outside of whatever was happening inside the organization." A beat. "Where is she?" "I don't know." Elena absorbed that without breaking stride. They came out through the side entrance. Caruso's men were there. Fast, wordless movement. Elena into the second vehicle, Damian into the first, the convoy moving within 40 seconds of them hitting the street. His phone rang as they pulled away. The number was one he didn't recognize, and he answered it because at this point, unknown numbers were the only ones delivering real information. "You moved her." Victor's voice, no smoothness now, something harder underneath, the thing that had always been underneath. "That was a mistake." Damian said nothing. "I want you to understand," Victor said, "that this doesn't have to be what it's become. The original arrangement was clean. Elena walks away. You focus on running the organization. I handle the operational expansion. Everyone gets something they want." "You threatened my wife," Damian said. "I managed a liability. She was going to be used against you eventually. By someone, by anyone. I just controlled how it happened." The voice was completely level. The voice of a man who had assembled a justification for this over many months and had it ready. "You're not thinking clearly, Damian. You haven't been thinking clearly for 2 years because she's been in the way of it. I fixed that." "Where is Petra Vasek?" A pause. "Somewhere safe. She'll stay safe as long as this situation resolves cleanly." "What does cleanly look like to you?" "You come in, we sit down, we have a real conversation about the future of this organization, about what it needs and who's actually equipped to run it. No file drops, no financial investigators, no retired enforcers running surveillance operations." Another pause. "I know everything you've been doing for the last 48 hours, Damian. I've known since you went to the storage unit. You have a very good hidden room. You should have changed the ventilation system when you had the basement renovated. The thermal signature is distinctive." He sat with that. Victor had known, had let him investigate, let him build the picture, and had been watching the whole time. The call about Elena being moved, not from an ally then, from Victor. A false flag to create urgency, to force Damian to accelerate in a direction Victor was prepared for. "Petra Vasek doesn't know anything that isn't already in your hands," Victor said. "The financial records. Briggs gave you good material. I'd have given you better, actually, if you'd asked me. I'm not trying to destroy you. I'm trying to run this organization with someone who still understands what it requires. You want a partnership, Damian said flatly. I want what I've earned. 4 years as your underboss, a decade before that building this thing from street level. You built an empire, and then you spent 2 years distracted by a woman who was never going to be able to live inside what you are. A shift in the voice, something almost like regret, almost like real feeling. I like you, Damian. I always have. Which is why I'm calling you instead of letting tonight conclude the way it was scheduled to conclude. What was it scheduled to conclude as? Silence. Deliberate. Come in, Victor said. Alone. The address I'm sending you now. Give me 2 hours to show you what the organization looks like under a structure that actually works. If you disagree, we negotiate. If you can't negotiate, he paused. Then at least Petra Vasek goes home safe, and Elena leaves the city with enough money to disappear somewhere pleasant. The call ended. The vehicle was moving through the pre-dawn city. Damian looked at the address that had just arrived on his screen. A warehouse on the eastern waterfront. Organization property, part of the legitimate logistics operation, large enough to hold a serious number of men. He opened a line to Caruso's vehicle. You heard that? Every word, Caruso said. He's had your second phone tapped, which means he's had the Briggs communication, the Vasek approach, all of it. And he waited. He waited because he wanted you to have enough to understand what he'd built before he showed you that he knew you knew. He's been managing this conversation for 48 hours. Everything you thought you were doing quietly, he's been directing it. A pause. He's very good. I know, Damian said. If you go to that warehouse, I know. Damian, he's got Vasek. If the documentation you needed was what she was carrying and he has her, then you don't have a provable chain. You have a pattern, and you have Briggs's financial work, which Briggs will deny providing the moment his name comes up in any official context. You go to the senior men with what you have right now, without the signed authorization documents, and Victor sits across from them with 11 years of institutional loyalty and tells a different story, and half of them won't know which one to believe. That was the problem. That had always been the problem. Victor had built this carefully enough that confronting it publicly without airtight documentation would fracture the organization along lines that were already under stress. Half the senior men would hold, half might not. And a fractured organization in the middle of a direct confrontation with its own underboss was exactly the kind of chaos that external enemies spent years hoping for. Victor had constructed the situation so that every move Damian could make created a different kind of damage. Go to the warehouse alone. Walk into whatever was waiting there. Go to the senior men without proof. Risk a split. Run with Elena. Abandon everything he'd built and leave Victor in possession of it. 3 doors. All of them bad. He looked at the city moving past the window and thought about the thing Victor had said, the organization under a structure that actually works, and understood that Victor was not bluffing about the partnership offer. The man genuinely believed it, had spent a decade telling himself a story in which his ambition was rationalized as operational necessity, in which Damian's marriage was a genuine organizational liability rather than something Victor had deliberately poisoned, in which what he'd built was a logical evolution rather than a palace coup constructed one calculated move at a time. That genuine belief was actually the most dangerous thing about him. A man running a pure power play could be negotiated with because power plays had prices. A man who had convinced himself he was right was something else. His phone buzzed. Elena, from the second vehicle. The text said, "There's something I haven't told you. Something I found 2 months ago that I didn't know what to do with. I need to show you before you do anything." He stared at the message. Then he typed back, "What is it?" Her reply took 40 seconds. Long enough that he felt the 40 seconds. Victor isn't working alone. There's someone above him. Someone whose name I found in documents I wasn't supposed to find, in a meeting I wasn't supposed to know about. And when I realized what I was looking at, I understood why they needed me gone and why killing you directly was never their first choice. The person above Victor has been inside your organization longer than Victor has. It's not someone you suspect. It's someone you trust completely. The vehicles moved through the cold dark, and Damian Moretti sat with the message on his screen and felt the ground shift under everything he thought he'd understood, and understood that he had not in fact been one step behind Victor Salazar. He had been 2 steps behind someone else entirely. He pulled Elena into his vehicle at the next intersection. She got in without being asked, the way she always moved in a crisis. Fast, no wasted motion, the bag across her lap and her eyes already reading him before the door closed. She looked different up close than she had in the doorway of the hotel room. The exhaustion was still there, but something else had come through it in the last 20 minutes. Something harder. The particular quality she got when she had decided that the situation required her to be something other than careful. "Tell me," he said. The convoy kept moving. Caruso's vehicle ahead, one behind, the city still mostly dark around them, with the first gray suggestion of morning beginning at the edge of the eastern sky. 2 months ago, Elena said, I was at the office building on Crane Street, the legitimate one, dropping something for your accountants. I was early. The conference room on the 4th floor was occupied. I could see through the glass partition. Victor was there, and someone else. She paused. One breath. Gerald Fenn. Well, Damian went very still. They had documents spread across the table. I couldn't read them from where I was, but I watched Fenn sign something and hand it to Victor, and Victor sign something and hand it back. The kind of exchange... She stopped. Started again. The kind of exchange that doesn't happen between a family attorney and a client's employee, unless they're not operating in those roles anymore. Gerald Fenn, 40 years of family law, handled Damian's prenuptial agreement, handled every major legal instrument in Damian's professional life for the last 11 years, had access to the full architecture of his financial holdings, his legitimate entities, his estate documentation, had, in the technical legal sense, a complete map of everything Damian had built and exactly how it was structured and where every point of leverage existed, and never looked him in the eye. Damian had always attributed that to professional deference. He understood now it was something else. A man who has been building a case against you for years learns not to look at you too directly. Why didn't you tell me? He said. His voice was flat. He was keeping it flat with effort. Because 3 days after I saw that meeting, someone left an envelope under our front door. No return, no name. Inside was a photograph of you, getting out of your car, with a red circle drawn around your head. She looked at him steadily. I understood the message. I was supposed to leave, keep quiet, and not bring you anything that would make you start pulling threads. If I gave you Fenn's name, you'd go to him, you'd confront him, and they'd kill me before I could use it. Yes. He looked out the window. Fenn, the man who had received the divorce papers that morning in his beige office and told Damian everything was in order. Who had called Victor when the Portsmouth meeting was supposedly delayed. Who had, 11 years ago, drafted a prenuptial agreement that contained provisions Damian had never revisited. Provisions that, in the event of Damian's death or incapacitation, directed significant organizational assets through a legal trust structure that would be administered by... He pulled out his phone, opened the financial files from Briggs. He'd looked at them 4 times and had seen what he expected to see. Now he looked for something different. He looked for the legal entity names, the trust structures, the administrative designations. It took him 6 minutes. In those 6 minutes, the convoy drove 12 blocks, and Elena sat beside him and didn't say anything and didn't need to. He found it. The parent entity above Victor's shell company. He'd looked at it and seen an anonymous investment structure. He looked at it again now with Fenn's name in his head and saw what it actually was. A legal trust, 11 years old, with a structure that matched almost exactly the administrative framework Fenn had established for Damian's own estate documentation. The same clause language, the same sub-entity architecture, built by the same hand. Fenn hadn't just been helping Victor. Fenn had been the architect. Victor was the operational layer. Fenn was the thing underneath it. The man with 11 years of legal access and not a single piece of organizational blood on his hands, who had been constructing the mechanism through which everything Damian had built would transfer, cleanly and legally, the moment Damian was no longer in the picture. He called Caruso. Fenn, he said. A pause. The attorney. Find him. Right now. Don't let him leave the city. It's 5 a.m. I know what time it is. Damian, if Fen is what you think he is, he may already be moving. If Victor called him after you took Elena, then move faster than he does. I need him contained, and I need the documents he signed at the Crane Street office 2 months ago. Elena can describe the room. She can tell you which table, which side of the room they were sitting on. Any smart attorney keeps copies of everything he signs. If those documents are in his office, we need them before he gets to them. He handed the phone to Elena. She described the meeting, the table, the seating, the folder colors, everything she'd seen through the glass partition. Caruso was typing as she talked. When she finished and handed the phone back, Caruso said, 40 minutes, maybe less. You have 30, Damian said. He ended the call. Elena was looking at him, not the careful, managed look she'd been using for the last 8 months. The real one. Direct and unguarded in the way she'd been that night on the terrace 11 years ago, before she knew he was watching. What are you going to do? She said. What needs to be done? That's not an answer. I know. He looked at her. Victor wants me at the warehouse on the eastern waterfront. He wants to offer me a partnership. And Fen? Fen wants me dead and replaced with a legal mechanism that transfers everything I've built into a structure he controls with Victor as the operational face. The partnership offer is theater. Victor believes in it, I think, or has convinced himself he does. But the endgame was never a partnership. It was the same endgame it's always been. They just needed me to walk into the warehouse believing it was a negotiation. Elena absorbed this the way she absorbed most difficult information, quickly, completely, without the luxury of denial. So don't go to the warehouse, she said. I have to go to the warehouse. Damian, Petra Vasek is somewhere inside that organization, probably somewhere in or near the waterfront property. If I don't show, Victor accelerates whatever contingency he has for noncompliance, and she becomes a liability he doesn't need. He looked at Elena steadily. And I need Victor in one place. I need him thinking he controls the narrative for the next 2 hours. Because while he's managing me at the warehouse, Caruso is going to Fen. And if we get those documents, the signed authorization files, whatever Fen and Victor exchanged at Crane Street, then I have the complete chain. Then I have something I can bring to the senior men that they cannot look away from. And if Caruso doesn't get there in time? He didn't answer that. Then you walk into a warehouse alone, Elena said, with incomplete documentation, to face a man who has been preparing this moment for 10 months, and his contingency for you not cooperating is, I won't be alone, he said. She looked at him. I need you to make a call, he said. There are 2 men, Rios and Castellan, old guard, been with the family longer than Victor has, longer than Fen has. I've never given them significant operational authority because they don't like the friction of it. They're loyal in the way that simple men are loyal. Not because they've calculated the value of it, but because it's the only mode they know. He held her eyes. They will come if you ask them. Not if I ask. My phone may be compromised, and a direct ask from me triggers Victor's monitoring. But you're outside the organization. A call from you doesn't fit the pattern they're watching for. What do I tell them? That I need them at the Eastern Waterfront warehouse at 6:15, armed, ready to move on my signal. Tell them exactly that, and nothing else. She took his phone, looked at the contacts, found the numbers, and made the calls. Rios picked up immediately. The deep, unhurried voice of a man who had been awake for a long time, which meant he'd already been uneasy about something. He said 4 words after Elena delivered the message. We'll be there. Castellan's phone rang 7 times, and then he answered with the thick voice of interrupted sleep, but he sharpened fast, the way men in their world sharpened fast when they needed to, and said, Understood, 6:15. She handed the phone back. They rode in silence for 30 seconds, and then Elena said, I'm coming in with you. No. I know that building. I did an event inspection there 2 years ago. The legitimate business used it for a corporate function, and I helped coordinate the catering. I know the floor plan. I know where the secondary office is, where the loading bay connects to the internal corridor, where the blind spots are in the camera positions. He looked at her. You need me inside, she said. Not asking, stating. He wanted to tell her no, wanted to put her in a vehicle with Caruso's men and send her somewhere the word waterfront was not part of the address, and deal with Victor and Fen and the complete destruction of 10 months of careful construction using only the resources he'd assembled. He wanted to do that because the alternative, Elena inside a warehouse with armed men who had a vested interest in her not walking out, was something that put a specific cold fear in his chest that he did not have language for and did not want to examine. But she knew the building, and he didn't. "You stay behind me," he said. "Always," she said, and the word carried 12 years of history in a way that landed somewhere under his sternum and stayed there. They arrived at the waterfront at 6:08. The warehouse was a long, low industrial building set back from the water, legitimate signage on the exterior, 3 visible entry points, and at least one he knew about that wasn't visible. The convoy stopped 2 blocks short. Damian and Elena got out. Caruso's men fanned to positions without being told. They knew their jobs. They'd been doing versions of them for years. Damian checked the weapon at his hip, looked at Elena, who had taken something from Caruso's man, a small, flat automatic that she held with the practiced familiarity of someone who had spent years adjacent to violence and had made herself competent because the alternative was being helpless. He had taught her to shoot in the 2nd year of their marriage in a basement range, and she had learned with the same focused attention she gave to everything she decided was worth learning. He took her hand. 1 second, then let go. They went in through the eastern loading door, which Elena keyed from a physical memory of the building's layout, navigating the corridor without hesitation, past the cold storage unit and the secondary office she'd described, moving in the direction of the main floor. Victor was there. He was standing in the center of the warehouse floor, in the large open space between the shelving rows, with 4 men positioned at intervals around the perimeter. He was dressed the same way he'd been at dinner, dark jacket, no tie. He looked at Damian walk in, and something moved across his face that was not quite surprise, but was a cousin of it. He hadn't expected Elena. "Damian," he said. His voice was back to smooth. Whatever had been underneath during the phone call was packed back down. "I said alone." "You said a lot of things," Damian said. He kept walking until he was 20 feet from Victor and stopped. Elena stayed 3 feet behind his left shoulder. "Where's Vasek?" "Safe." "I told you. Where is she?" A pause. Victor looked at Elena again, recalibrating. "Secondary office, northeast corner. She's fine." He brought his eyes back to Damian. "You did the right thing coming here. This is the conversation we should have had a long time ago." "Where's Fen?" Damian said. Nothing moved on Victor's face. That was itself a tell. The complete absence of reaction was the reaction of a man who had prepared for this name to come up. "Gerald Fen is your attorney. I don't know why you'd be asking me." "Victor," Damian kept his voice level. "We're past the part where that works." Victor looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted. The performance ended, not dramatically, not with any visible collapse. Just a quiet settling into something more honest. The way a mask comes off, not when it's ripped away, but when the man wearing it decides he's done. "Elena told you about Crane Street." "Yes." "She wasn't supposed to see that." "No. A lot of things weren't supposed to happen the way they happened. You built something very precise, and it came apart at one edge." Damian watched him. "You didn't plan for her." "I planned for every variable. You planned for my marriage being a weakness. You were right about that. You didn't plan for it also being a strength." He let that land. "She didn't run. She didn't tell me what she knew and let me protect her. She sat alone with a death threat and a secret for 8 months to keep me alive. That's not a liability. That's the only real asset I have." A pause. "You misread her." Victor's jaw tightened, 1 degree, barely visible. "This doesn't change the practical reality of where we are." "No," Damian said. "It doesn't." He looked at the 4 men at the perimeter. He knew 2 of them. The other 2 were new, not organization regulars, which meant private hires, which meant Victor had not trusted this operation entirely to men whose loyalty Damian might be able to flip. Smart, but not smart enough. From outside the building, at intervals that were clearly positioned, there came the sound of vehicles. 3. 2 doors on each, moving into position around the perimeter. Rios and Castellan, with whoever they'd brought. Victor heard it too. His eyes moved to the building's exterior walls and back. "You brought people," Victor said. "Old guard," Damian said. "Men who have been with this family since before you knew what this family was." He watched Victor's face. "You've been running your private operation inside my organization for 10 months. You moved money, you moved people, you positioned assets, but you didn't move the men who were here before the money existed. You didn't touch Rios, you didn't touch Castellan, because you couldn't, because loyalty that old doesn't have a price point you could meet." Something moved through Victor's expression, something that might, in a different life, have been respect. "What happens now?" "You tell me where Fen is, right now. One chance." Victor looked at him, the smooth face, the careful eyes that had spent a decade reading Damian Moretti and believed it understood him completely. "And if I don't?" The warehouse door opened. Caruso walked in. Behind him, Petra Vasek, alive, upright, a bruise along her left cheekbone that Damian clocked and filed with a cold, specific fury, and behind her, 2 of Caruso's men carrying a document case. Victor's eyes went to the case. And for the first time in the 10 months of this operation, Damian watched something break through the surface of Victor Salazar's composure. Not fear. Something closer to the recognition that a very precise machine had just lost a critical piece. "She had a copy," Victor said, very quietly. "She made a copy." "She made 2, Caruso said from the door. "One for the drop that you intercepted. One that she mailed to herself 3 weeks ago when she first got scared, because she's smarter than you gave her credit for." Victor stood in the center of the warehouse floor and looked at the document case and understood what was inside it and what it meant for every carefully constructed layer of his operation. The signed authorizations, the Fen signatures, the financial chain, complete. Then he looked back at Damian, and he made his decision. It happened fast. The way these things always happen fast. The way the long, slow build of a situation could compress into 3 seconds of absolute violence without warning. Victor's hand moved. The 2 private hire men at the perimeter raised weapons. Victor himself went for the gun at his back, which Damian had noted and positioned for since walking in. Damian was already moving. The distance between them was 20 feet, and he covered it in the time it took Victor to clear the weapon from the holster, which was not quite enough time. The gun came up. Damian's hand caught Victor's wrist, redirecting the line of fire, the shot going wide and loud in the metal space of the warehouse. Behind Damian, the sound of Elena moving, fast, lateral, taking cover behind the shelving row the way he'd told her to if anything went loud, and she did it without being told again, which was why he'd married her. Caruso's men were already engaged with the private hires at the perimeter. Rios and Castellan's people were coming through the exterior doors. The warehouse filled with the compressed chaos of a close-quarters fight. Not cinematic, not clean, all impact and proximity, and the animal effort of 2 men trying to resolve 10 months of constructed betrayal with their hands and the limited space between them. Victor was strong. Damian had known that abstractly and understood it concretely now. The man fought with the suppressed physicality of someone who had kept himself capable precisely for a moment like this. They went into the shelving, metal racket, products hitting the floor. Victor got an elbow into Damian's ribs that sent bright pain across his torso, and he absorbed it and used the momentum to turn Victor's back to the shelving and drive him into it. The gun was on the floor between them. They both knew it was there. Victor went for it. Damian let him get his hand on it, let him get his fingers around the grip, and then said, quietly, in the half-second before anything else could happen, "Fen, last chance, Victor." "Where?" Victor looked up at him from the floor. His face was a portrait of a man calculating and finding that the numbers had finally stopped working in his favor. His hand on the weapon. Damian's foot on his wrist. The sounds of the perimeter fight dying down. Caruso's men, Rios and Castellan's people, consolidating. The warehouse resolving around them. "He's already gone," Victor said. His voice was different now, stripped of the smoothness, raw underneath, like the voice of the actual man who had been inside the performance for years. He left the city last night, private charter. I told him to move when you took Elena, because I knew— He stopped, breathed. I knew that if she'd told you about Crane Street, the documentation would follow. Fen has been running since 2 a.m. Damian pressed his foot down on Victor's wrist. Where? He said. Victor's jaw worked. The calculation going on behind his eyes was visible for the first time. No performance left to obscure it. A man deciding what his situation was worth, what he was worth, what deal, if any, existed in the space between him and the floor and the man standing over him. There's a second set of documents, Victor said, not the Crane Street set, older, from before I involved Fen, from when this was just between me and one other person, a person whose name is on a transfer authorization from 9 years ago, before you were what you are now, when you were still building, when you trusted someone enough to give them access codes that were never supposed to exist past the first year of the operation. He looked up at Damian steadily. Those documents are in a location that only I know, and they named the person who came to me 9 years ago and told me that Damian Moretti was going to be the most powerful man in this city, and that when he was, the right person in the right position could take everything he'd built. The warehouse was quiet now, completely quiet. The way a large space gets quiet when the violence inside it has resolved and everyone remaining is listening. Who came to you? Damian said. Victor looked at him, and for a moment, just a moment, something in his expression was almost human, almost like a man who understood the weight of what he was about to say and felt it. Someone who was in your life before I was, Victor said. Someone who has been watching you build this empire for 9 years and has been patient in a way that makes everything I did look like improvisation. He paused. Someone Elena has met. Someone she would recognize if she saw the name on that document. His eyes moved past Damian's shoulder. Ask her. Ask her who, in the first year of your marriage, you trusted enough to make a silent partner in everything you were building. Someone whose name never appears in any public documentation, but who has had a claim on a percentage of this organization since before it was worth anything. A breath. Because that person is the one who built me. And if you want Fen, that person can tell you where he went, because they told him when to run. Damian straightened, took his foot off Victor's wrist, didn't touch the weapon on the floor, looked across the warehouse at Elena, who was standing at the edge of the shelving row, completely still, her face in the first gray light coming through the high industrial windows, carrying an expression he had never seen on her before. Not shock, not fear. Recognition. She knew the name before he asked. The name Elena said was Marco. Not Victor's Marco. Not some peripheral figure Damian could reassign and reframe in his memory without too much cost. His Marco. The man who had driven him for 9 years through rain and silence and every version of the life he'd built. The man who had been in the car this morning when Damian rode to Fen's office with the divorce papers in his pocket. The man who had been present, physically present, for more of Damian's private movements and unguarded moments than anyone else alive. She said it quietly, standing at the edge of the shelving row in the gray warehouse light, her voice completely steady in the way it got when she was absorbing something that was too large for any other response. Just the one word. His name. And then she looked at Damian and said, Your uncle introduced them 9 years ago at the dinner in Cartagena. I didn't understand what I was seeing then. I was new. I didn't know what introductions between certain men meant. She paused. I've been trying to remember that dinner for 2 months, trying to remember who else was at the table. And last week it came back to me. Marco was there, sitting 2 seats down from your uncle. And your uncle leaned over and said something to him that made Marco look at you just once across the table with an expression I didn't have context for at the time. Damian stood very still. 9 years. The math of it moved through him like cold water, before Victor, before Fen, before any of the operational architecture that had been constructed around the empire he'd built. At the very foundation of it, in the year when he was still assembling the organization into something durable, someone had looked at what he was going to become and installed a witness. A quiet, reliable, completely trusted witness who sat in the front seat of his car and heard every phone call and knew every destination and had been feeding the intelligence that made all of it possible for 9 years without Damian ever once suspecting him. Because Marco didn't seem like a man with ambitions. That had been the genius of it. Victor had ambitions you could read if you looked carefully enough. The patience that was too studied, the positioning that was too precise. Marco was just the driver, just the man who showed up at 7 and said nothing and went where he was told. The perfect cover because it required no cover. It simply required being beneath notice. Damian looked at Victor on the floor. "Where are the documents?" he said. "A safe deposit box, Merchant Bank on Calloway Street. Box number registered under the name of a deceased individual. I have the key." Victor held his gaze. "I'll give it to you, in exchange for what you're going to offer me anyway, because you need those documents more than you need me." "What do you think I'm going to offer you?" "A way out that doesn't end in this warehouse." Victor said it without self-pity, just the flat statement of a man who understood his position and was calculating its value accurately. "You need Marco. You need Fen. I can help you get to both of them. And when this is finished and you're restructuring what's left, you're going to want someone who knows where everybody is buried in the organization, because some of those bodies are yours, and you don't know they're there yet." The warehouse was quiet around them. Caruso stood near the door, watching. Rios and Castellan's men held the perimeter. Petrovasek sat against the wall near the northeast corner, a man beside her, the bruise on her face dark in the low light. She was watching Damian with the expression of someone who has been very frightened for a long time and is trying to determine whether it's safe yet to stop. He looked at Elena. She gave him nothing. No direction, no opinion. This one was his. "Get up," he told Victor. Victor got up, slowly. He retrieved nothing from the floor. Left the weapon where it was. He stood and straightened his jacket with a gesture that was so habitual it looked almost absurd given the circumstances. The automatic dignity of a man who had been careful about his appearance for so long that it continued even here. "Caruso," Damian said. "Take him. Separate vehicle. The box on Calloway Street first, then somewhere contained where I can find him when I need him." Caruso moved. Victor went with him without being told twice, which was either cooperation or the understanding that resistance was no longer a realistic option. At the door he stopped once and looked back, not at Damian, but at Elena. A look that was hard to categorize, not apology, not defiance, something closer to acknowledgement. You were the variable I didn't account for. Then he was gone. Damian crossed the warehouse floor to Petrovasek. He crouched down to her level. She looked at him with dark eyes that had too much in them, fear, exhaustion, and something that might have been relief but was afraid to commit to it. "Are you hurt?" he said. The face. Nothing structural. Her voice was steady. She'd been an accountant for 15 years in an organization where the cost of certain kinds of knowledge was sometimes physical. She'd known that when she made the copies and mailed them to herself. "I didn't give them the second location. They didn't ask the right questions." "I know." He looked at her steadily. "What you did took courage." She looked away. Not from modesty, from the discomfort of direct recognition, which people who had spent careers being professionally invisible were not always comfortable receiving. "I just thought it was right," she said. The same words, he suspected, she'd thought to herself in the 3 months she'd been sitting on the information, deciding whether to bring it forward. He stood. One of Caruso's men helped her to her feet. He told them where to take her, a location she'd be comfortable and safe in while the remaining business was concluded, and watched them go. Then he turned to Elena. She was standing in the middle of the warehouse floor now, the bag still across her shoulder, the small automatic back with Caruso's man, her arms loose at her sides. The gray morning light coming through the high windows caught the angles of her face and the shadows under her eyes, and she looked like what she was, a woman who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had not yet been able to set it down. "Marco," he said. "I know." She held his eyes. "He drove you to the hospital yesterday morning. He knew you were there. If he told Victor everything. For 9 years, he told Victor everything, and Victor filtered it to Fen, and Fen used it to build a legal structure that would activate the moment I died or became incapacitated." He paused. The divorce was never the endgame. The divorce was supposed to isolate me, destabilize me, make me easier to move against directly when the moment was right, with a legal succession already in place, so there was no organizational vacuum and no internal challenge to whatever structure Fen had built. She absorbed this. Where is Marco now? At the house. He dropped me at the hospital yesterday and I drove myself after. He'll be there this morning at 7 with the car, because that's what he does every morning. He checked his watch. 6:41. 19 minutes. Damian. She stepped closer, not reaching for him, just closing the distance between them to something honest. He's been with you for 9 years. He knows everything about how you move, how you think when you're vulnerable. If you go to the house and he understands that you know, I know. That's not a situation where I know what it is, he said. Quiet. Final. She looked at him for a long moment. I'm coming with you. This time he didn't say no. They drove to the house in Rios's vehicle, Rios himself at the wheel, which was a thing Damian noted and said nothing about. The particular fullness of having a man he trusted driving him after 9 years of something else. The city was waking up around them. Traffic beginning. The ordinary texture of a Tuesday morning assembling itself while the last pieces of a 10-year operation moved toward their conclusion. Marco's car was in the driveway. He was early. 6:53, standing beside the car in his dark jacket, the way he stood every morning, patient, unhurried, present. He looked up when Rios's vehicle pulled in, and his expression went through several things very quickly, each one visible for less than a second before the next one replaced it. Confusion at the unfamiliar vehicle, recognition of Damian in the passenger seat, and then, underneath both of those, the thing that confirmed everything. A very rapid calculation that lasted perhaps 2 seconds before it resolved into stillness. The stillness of a man who understands the situation. Damian got out, walked toward him across the driveway, stopped 6 feet away. Marco looked at him. He was 61 years old with a broad, weathered face and the particular physical solidity of a man who had done physical work his entire life. There was no fear in his expression. That was perhaps the most honest thing about him. He had been doing this for 9 years, and he was not going to spend whatever time was left on fear. How long have you known? Marco said. His voice was the same as it always was. The voice Damian had heard from the front seat of a car through every significant event of the last 9 years. I found out last night, Damian said. Elena identified you from a meeting 9 years ago. Marco nodded slowly. His eyes moved briefly to Elena, who was standing near Rios's vehicle. Something moved through his expression. Not regret exactly, but a kind of heavy acknowledgement. She was always sharper than people gave her credit for. He brought his eyes back to Damian. I told Victor that. From the beginning. I told him she was the variable he wasn't respecting. But you kept reporting anyway. It was an arrangement, made before I knew what you were going to become. Before you became... He paused, looked for the word. What you are. By the time I understood the full scope of what Fen had planned, I was too deep inside it to walk out the other side. A pause. That's not an excuse. I'm not offering it as one. No, Damian said. You're not. They looked at each other. 9 years of mornings, 9 years of silence in a car, of routes taken, of doors held, of the particular intimate proximity of a man who drives you through your own life. Damian thought about every call he'd taken in that car, every destination, every unguarded moment in transit between the performance of one version of himself and another. Your uncle asked me to watch you, Marco said. That was the original arrangement. Just watch, report. He was concerned you were moving too fast, building too large, that you would attract attention that couldn't be managed. He wanted eyes. He wasn't... Another pause. What happened with Fen, with Victor, that evolved after your uncle was gone. By then I was in a structure I didn't control. You could have come to me. Marco looked at him with something very close to sadness. Could I? Damian didn't answer that, because the answer was complicated in a way that the morning didn't have space for. A man who had been placed as an informant by someone Damian had trusted absolutely, who had been inside a structure for 9 years, coming forward, what would that have looked like? What would Damian have done? He knew what he would have done. He would have done exactly what the situation would have seemed to require, and Marco had known that too, and had weighed it, and had decided that the weight of one betrayal was preferable to the certainty of what confession would cost him. "Where's Fen?" Damian said. Marco was quiet for a moment. Then, "A private property in coastal Portugal. He has a standing arrangement there, uses it 2 or 3 times a year legitimately, so there's no pattern to the travel. He'll stay until he's certain one way or another how this resolved." He held Damian's eyes. "I can give you the property address and the name of the man in Lisbon who manages Fen's European accounts, the ones that aren't in any documentation you've already recovered." Damian said nothing. "I know what I am," Marco said, not asking for anything, just stating it. "I know what this costs you. I'm not going to perform contrition at you because you've seen through enough performances this week to last a lifetime." He straightened slightly, the dignity that had nothing to do with the situation and everything to do with the man. "I'll tell you what I know. All of it. Whatever use it is." "Get in the house," Damian said. Marco walked past him. Damian stood in the driveway for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, the morning air cold and still around him. Then Elena was beside him. Not touching him, just beside him, in the particular way she had of being present without intruding on whatever he was moving through. "You all right?" she said. "No," he said. "No," she agreed. They went inside. What followed was 3 hours that Damian would not describe to anyone afterward, not because they were violent, they weren't, but because they were the kind of hours that belonged to no category he had language for. Marco sat at the kitchen table, which was somehow both ordinary and impossible, and talked. Damian listened. Elena sat across the room and said nothing. Caruso arrived after 40 minutes and took over the documentation of what Marco was saying, recording it on a device, asking clarifying questions in the flat professional tone of a man whose job was to extract information accurately and without emotional editorializing. The Portugal property address. The Lisbon contact. The names of 2 additional men in the organization who had been reporting to Marco, who had been reporting to Victor, who had been reporting through a communication channel that Damian now had the technical map of. The full architecture of what had been built around him, below the surface, described from the inside by the man who had occupied its foundation. At the end of it, Marco sat back in his chair and looked at his hands and said nothing more. Damian stood, looked at Caruso. Caruso nodded once, and 2 of his men came in from the hall, and Marco got up from the table without being asked and went with them. At the door he stopped, turned, looked at Damian one more time. "For what it's worth," he said. "It's not," Damian said. Marco nodded and went. The kitchen was quiet. Caruso gathered his equipment, spoke briefly to Elena about the extraction team's current positions, and excused himself with the professional discretion of a man who understood when he was no longer needed in a room. Damian stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the surface of it. The same counter he'd eaten breakfast at for 11 years. The same house, the same kitchen, the same morning light coming through the same east-facing windows. Different than it had been yesterday. Different in the way that everything was different once you'd seen what was underneath it, not because the surface had changed, but because you couldn't look at it the same way anymore. Elena poured water into 2 glasses, set one in front of him, drank from her own standing at the counter 3 feet away. "Fen," she said, "Caruso will handle the Lisbon contact. Between that and the documents from the box on Calloway Street, I have what I need to make a formal request for his extradition. He has enough exposure in the financial structures that a competent attorney, one who isn't him, can build a case that runs him to ground." He paused. "It'll take time. It won't be clean. But it'll happen. Yes." She looked at her water glass. "And the organization. The 2 men Marco identified will be dealt with today. The lieutenant positions Victor left open. I'll fill from the existing roster, men who've been passed over because Victor was managing the promotions to keep his people in the critical positions." He paused. "It's going to take months to fully clean out what was built in there. The financial structures Fen created are legal instruments. They'll have to be unwound through legitimate processes, slowly, carefully, in a way that doesn't create exposure." So you'll be busy, she said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I need to say something to you, and I need you to let me finish it. He looked at her. I should have come to you, she said, when the envelope came, when the threat started. I know why I didn't. I've explained it, and I think my reasons were real. But I need to say plainly that I made a decision without you that was mine to make, but also wasn't. And it cost us 8 months and nearly cost us everything. She held his eyes steadily. I decided I knew better than you how to protect you. And I was wrong. Not about the threat being real. It was real, but about handling it alone. That was wrong. He looked at her for a long moment. I spent 8 months watching you disappear and telling myself it was inevitable. That it was the natural consequence of what I am and what that costs the people adjacent to me. He set his glass down. I didn't ask. I didn't push. I let you recede and called it wisdom. I was a coward, dress it up as acceptance. You believed what you saw. I believed what I was shown because it fit a story I'd already been telling myself. That's not the same as being deceived. That's being willing to be deceived. He looked at the kitchen counter. I've been building this organization for 12 years, and I've always understood that the things inside it can be weaponized by the wrong people. I never understood that I could be weaponized against myself, that my own certainty was the mechanism. Elena said nothing. Let that sit. I signed the papers, he said. I know. I stood in Fenn's office and signed them and walked out. I put my signature on 12 years. Damian, I'm not... He stopped, started again. The thing in his chest that had been building for 4 days was not going to be spoken about directly. He didn't have that language and probably never would. I need you to know I signed them believing it was what you wanted. That's all. She looked at him for a long time. Something moved across her face that was not quite a smile and not quite the absence of one. What do you need right now? She said. He thought about it, genuinely thought about it, which was not something he did often. Most of what he needed went unexamined because examining it produced no actionable result, and he was a man oriented toward actionable results. I need this to be over, he said. Not today. Eventually. I need the organization to be clean and smaller and something I don't have to defend against from the inside. I'm tired of the inside being the most dangerous direction. That's going to take a long time. I know. Are you going to do it? Yes. She nodded, set her glass down, and then, without ceremony or announcement, she crossed the 3 feet of kitchen between them and put her arms around him. Just that. He stood for a moment with his hands at his sides, and then he put them around her, and they stood in the morning kitchen of the house they'd shared for 11 years, with everything that had happened in the last 4 days between them like sediment settling after a flood, still there, visible, but beginning to reveal the shape of the ground underneath. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. They stood there until his phone rang. It was Caruso. The Callaway Street box had been opened. The documents were in hand. Complete, signed, dated, constituting the evidentiary foundation for everything that followed. He listened to Caruso's summary, said 3 words, "Bring it here," and put the phone down. Elena stepped back, looked at him, straightened the collar of his jacket with the automatic gesture of someone who had done it so many times it lived in muscle memory, and then seemed to realize what she'd done and stopped with her hands on his lapels. He covered her hands with his, just for a moment, then let go. Over the following weeks, Damian Moretti did what he said he was going to do. He did it methodically and without announcement, in the way that he did most things that mattered. The 2 compromised lieutenants were removed, not violently, but completely, with the specific finality that the organization understood, and that left no ambiguity about what had occurred or why. The financial structures Fenn had built were handed to a team of attorneys who had been vetted personally and had no prior connection to the existing organization, and they began the slow, technical work of unwinding 11 years of legal architecture. Victor Salazar provided information for 6 weeks, not willingly, exactly, but with the cooperation of a man who understood that the information was his only remaining currency and who spent it carefully, accurately, on things that checked out when verified. He identified 3 additional external contacts, 2 international financial arrangements, and the full technical map of the communication channels he and Marco had used. At the end of the 6 weeks, Damian made a decision about him that was neither merciful nor ruthless, but was, he believed, accurate to the situation. Victor would not remain in the city or the country, would surrender the documentation he'd signed at Crane Street and anything else still in his possession, and would understand that his continued existence was contingent on the permanent and complete cessation of any activity that touched Damian Moretti's life or organization. Victor took the arrangement. He left on a Wednesday, and Damian didn't watch him go. Gerald Fenn was located in Portugal 6 weeks after the warehouse. The extradition process was, as Damian had predicted, neither clean nor fast. But the documentation was airtight and the exposure was significant, and Fenn had spent 40 years being too clever to have built himself a way out of a situation where the evidence was complete. He was returned to face the legal consequences of 11 years of financial conspiracy, operating without apparent distress in the particular way of men who have spent careers in the law and understand that process, even adverse process, has predictable structures that can be navigated. Damian let the process work. He did not touch it. He had learned something in the course of 4 days about the cost of operating outside of every structure, and the lesson had been significant enough that he was willing to let Fenn face a courtroom. Marco he did not contact again. There was nothing left to say that had not been said in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, and he was not a man who revisited closed things to squeeze sentiment from them. Marco existed somewhere, he didn't know where, and had instructed Caruso that he didn't want to know. That was all. The organization contracted, deliberately, intentionally, over the course of 3 months, removing the layers that Victor had added during the restructuring, reducing the personnel and the operational surface area to something that could be monitored closely and defended without relying on a chain of trust that had proven to have fundamental failures. It was smaller afterward, and quieter. And Damian understood, in the way that men understand things they've been told many times but can only learn by experiencing the cost of not knowing, that smaller and quieter was not weakness but precision. The senior men who had been there before Victor accepted the restructuring. Rios and Castellan were given the operational authority they'd been passed over for, and they used it with the straightforward, uncomplicated competence of men who had never wanted anything beyond what the work required. There were no more meetings where Damian watched someone's eyes and tried to read what was underneath the performance. There were fewer people in the room. That helped. Elena did not move back into the house for 6 weeks. She returned to her own apartment, not the serviced hotel, but a place she'd chosen herself, in a neighborhood she liked, and they rebuilt things the way you rebuild things after structural damage, slowly, from the foundation up, not assuming any part of the original frame was still load-bearing without testing it first. They had dinner twice a week, sometimes at the house, sometimes at places she chose. They talked in ways they hadn't talked in years, not around things, not through the practiced shorthand of a couple who had shared space so long they'd stopped making complete sentences, but actually talked, with the directness of people who had been shown, comprehensively, what avoidance cost. He told her things he had never told anyone. Not confessions. He was not given to confession and didn't intend to start, but the actual texture of what the organization was, and what it had required of him, and what he had given it that he was not certain he should have given. She listened without performing reaction. Sometimes she asked questions. The questions were good. The questions of someone who had spent 12 years building an understanding of a world she couldn't fully participate in and now was being given access to the parts she'd been excluded from. She told him things too, about the 8 months, about what the threats had felt like and what she'd told herself every morning to keep moving through them, about the call she'd made to her mother in the hospital that she had not known he could hear, how the things she'd said had been the things she'd been unable to say to him, displaced onto her mother because her mother was the only person she was still allowed to be honest around. He listened to that last part in particular. He thought about standing in a hospital corridor 6 feet from a half-open door and understood that the most significant intelligence operation of his life had not been what he'd run in the following 4 days. It had been the 30 seconds he'd spent choosing to stand still and listen instead of walking past. One evening, late, he found the original divorce papers. Not the copies Fenn had filed. Those were in the legal process of being nullified, challenged on the grounds of the attorney's conflict of interest, a technical process that Damian's new legal team was handling, but the ones he'd signed himself. The physical documents, still in the envelope he'd taken out of Fenn's office, which had ended up in the drawer of the secondary desk in his study, the way things ended up in drawers when you were moving through a crisis and couldn't stop to deal with the ordinary objects it generated. He sat at the desk and looked at the envelope for a while. Then he took it to the balcony. The night was clear and cold. The city spread below in its ordinary arrangement of lights and movement and the countless ordinary lives being lived inside it, unaware of and uninterested in the specific drama that had been resolved inside their midst. He stood with the envelope in his hand and looked at the lights for a moment. Elena came out behind him. She'd been in the kitchen. She stood beside him, a glass of water in her hand, not asking what he was doing, just present in the way she'd been present since the morning in the warehouse, not performing anything, not managing anything, just occupying the space beside him as herself. He opened the envelope, took out the papers, looked at his signature on the line, the signature he'd pressed into the paper in Fenn's office, while Fenn watched with his eyes pointed slightly to the left of Damian's face. The signature of a man who believed he was ending something because he had been carefully and patiently convinced that it was already over. He tore them, not dramatically, just methodically, into pieces small enough that the wind off the balcony took them when he opened his hand, scattering them into the dark air in the way of things that have no further use and no reason to be kept. Elena watched the pieces go. "That's not legally sufficient," she said. "The filed copies still exist." "I know," he said, "but the filed copies are a legal process. This is something else." She looked at the place where the pieces had gone, already invisible in the dark. "What is it?" He thought about it. "An accurate statement of what I actually decided," he said, "as opposed to what I was maneuvered into." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to go back to the house. Not tonight, but soon. Whenever you're ready. I'm going to put my things in different places than they were before. I need it to feel chosen, not like I'm just resuming." "Wherever you want them," he said. She nodded, looked at the city. He looked at it with her. The ordinary light of an ordinary night, and the two of them standing on a balcony above it, which was not a triumphant image and was not meant to be, was just the actual texture of what survived after everything else had been burned away. Two people, worn down and clear-eyed and still standing, which is the only victory that was ever on offer, and is enough. The greatest battle of Damian Moretti's life had not been in a warehouse or a courtroom or the back room of a private restaurant. It had been in the accumulation of small, ordinary moments where he had chosen not to look closely enough, at his own assumptions, at the people nearest to him, at the particular silence of a woman who had been screaming without sound for 8 months because she loved him too much to let him hear it. He had nearly lost her to the version of himself that was certain he already understood everything worth understanding. He didn't intend to be that man again. The city lights held their steady positions below. The cold air moved between them and around them and past them and continued, indifferent and ordinary, on its way. He put his hand on the railing. After a moment, her hand settled beside his. That was all. That was exactly enough.